started. So if you are just coming in, please take a seat and let's get this show on the road. After that riveting session or talk from Devta Bhattacharya, I'd like to welcome you all with both hands folded. Namaskar. And welcome to South Asian Literature and Art Festival, or SALA as it is popularly known, and produced by Art Forum SF. This festival is special. You know why? Because of you. Because you are here to make it special. Thank you for your support for South Asian art and literature. Heartfelt thank you to all our sponsors for making this Literature and Art Festival a reality. Their dedication to supporting writers, artists, and this exchange of ideas keeps creativity flowing. Quick housekeeping rules: please turn off your cell phones or keep them on mute. No photography or recording. Everything will be available on YouTube later, so you can relive the brilliance at your own pace. Also, please make sure that you do not leave any belongings or water bottles behind. There will be 15 minutes for our Q&A after the session, followed by book signing by the author in the Florence Moore courtyard by the bookstore. And lastly, as a volunteer-run organization, we at SALA are deeply grateful to all our volunteers. Can we hear it for our stage assistant managers, my friend Aishwarya, Charu, and many others who are not here who made this event happen. So let's dive in, open our hearts and minds, and enjoy the stories that reminds how we are all connected. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to use one-liner introduction for myself. My name is Kavita Gupta, and I have been a long-term educator in public K-12 high school system here, 25 years to be exact. Thank you. A quarter century sounds impressive. The topic of today's discussion is Between Worlds, where our keynote speakers Nishant Batsha and Nina Sharma are in conversation with Shikha Malaviya. Shikha Malaviya is the author of Anand Bai Joshi, A Life in Poems, a unique retelling of the life of India's first female medical doctor and the first Indian woman to study medicine in the US. And as I was talking to her, she informed me that it was in 1883. Imagine that. Her previous book of poems is Geography of Tongues. Shikha's poetry has been nominated for several prizes, including Pushcart Prize, and featured in Catamaran Plume and many other fine publications. Shikha has been a featured TEDx speaker and was selected as Poet Laureate of San Ramon, California in 2016. She is the recipient of Mosaic America Fellowship and is a Writers Grotto member in San Francisco Bay Area. So without much ado, let's hear it from Shikha.
Thank you so much, Kavita, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It is my honor and pleasure to be in conversation with Nishant Batsha and Nina Sharma. Originally, this was supposed to be moderated by Lalita du Perron, but unfortunately she fell sick, and so I will do my very best to make this as robust a conversation as possible. I was only informed a day earlier, so if there are any mistakes from my side, please forgive me. Anyway, let us introduce our panelists today. Nishant Batsha is the author, most recently, of A Bomb Placed Close to the Heart. That title, by the way. The novel was named a summer read by the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Minnesota Star Tribune, among others. His first novel, Mother Ocean, Father Nation, was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award and was named a Best Book of 2022 by NPR, among other honors. He lives in Buffalo, New York with his family. Welcome, Nishant. Nina Sharma's work has appeared in outlets such as the Los Angeles Times, The New Yorker, Harper's Bazaar, and Electric Literature. Her debut personal essay collection is The Way You Make Me Feel, Love in Black and Brown. The Washington Post praises Sharma's debut as remarkable for its daring. How unafraid it is to eschew rosy visions of racial solidarity. She is formerly the programs director at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and she currently teaches at Barnard College and Columbia University, and is a proud co-founder of the comedy troupe Not Your BB Improv. Awesome. Welcome. So, I want to say that I did get a chance to go through these books, read some of Nina's essays, read some of Nishant's fiction, and when I first picked up these books, they seemed like they were two radically different books, you know, because one is a novel, a historical novel. Can I call it a historical novel? Okay, so it's a historical novel. And then, which takes place earlier in time, whereas Nina's book is a collection of essays which is set in contemporary America, right? So, at first I thought, this is interesting. What could they possibly have in common, right? But the more I read, the more I realized that you're both writing about the same thing, really. What happens when cultures crash into each other, and, with the most personal parts of our lives intertwining, right? So you're both refusing to let these difficult histories stay buried, stay back. You're moving into that inextricable tangle of, culture, identity, and much more. So I wanted to ask both of you if you could both talk a little bit of what your books are about, or what was the genesis of the books, and then maybe share a little bit from your works. That'd be awesome.
Thank you, Shikha, for the introduction, and thank you, Sala, for hosting and inviting me to speak today. So prior to the United States entry into World War I, there were quite a few revolutionaries from South Asia living in California, living in Palo Alto, living in Berkeley, living in San Francisco. They were agitating for the independence of India from within California. And I first came across this material when I was completing my doctorate in history. But nothing came from that moment in time. Their revolution was a failure for the most part. So you can't really write much about that from the perspective of writing of history. But I remained interested in that material through the writing of my first novel, and when I came down to writing my second novel, I remembered those historical characters. And I remembered one of them in particular, M.N. Roy. M.N. Roy was a revolutionary nationalist leader from Bengal who came to California to secure weapons from the Germans. It was a very convoluted government scheme. I have researched this, I have read it, and I still don't understand what he was actually looking for from the Germans and why he came to California for those weapons. But he came. And while he was in California, he arrived in San Francisco, came down to Palo Alto, and met and married a woman on the Stanford University campus, just down the street. And as the U.S. entered World War I, he and his wife, Evelyn Trent, were branded as traitors due to their German connection. There was a legal case known as the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. 17 people were arrested. The trial occurred in San Francisco. The trial itself was a story. Someone was shot in court for being a patsy. The media was covering it from coast to coast. It's a great little historical detour to research if you're ever interested in it. But M.N. Roy and Evelyn Trent escaped arrest and went onwards to New York City, where they stayed for a brief period of time. They went onwards to Mexico after that and founded together the Communist Party of Mexico. So they entered the world stage almost immediately. There are all these pictures of them, Trotsky and Lenin, down in Mexico City. It's amazing. But they went onwards to Berlin and had a terrible and messy divorce. Evelyn at that point was written out of history. M.N. Roy refused to mention her again. She makes no mention or no appearance in his memoirs. And when she moved back to California, her house, which was a duplex up in Auburn near Sacramento, burned down in a house fire in 1962. So all of her papers were lost. Evelyn Trent ceased to exist in the historical record at that point. And so you can't really write a history from that, but you can write fiction. And so I was interested in taking these characters. I turned them into Indra and Cora in this book, and I based them upon Roy and Trent. And I was interested in the story of how two world historical figures didn't who they were at a moment when they didn't know they were going to be important. So this book is at prehistory, that moment where they meet and they have this raw ambition, but they don't know where it's going to take them. So it's a story of ambitious individuals who don't know what life has in store for them. I'll read a little selection, and the first is from early in the book, where Indra has recently arrived at Palo Alto and meets up with Cora on the Stanford campus. And this is the second time. He fumbled for the watch in his pocket and found, for the fifth time that he arrived in that garden, the minutes would not vapor themselves away. He'd been pacing up and down the same portion of the garden's chalky dirt pathway, avoiding the splotches where it sank into the mud, and each time he would pass the same set of 4 columnar cacti, 2 on either side of him, all of them a dull green, taller than he by 3 or 4 heads. The garden was empty, which was no surprise because it seemed to be the most hastily put together garden he had ever seen, lacking the beauty and symmetry of the gardens of India. In lieu of the Muslim fantasy of paradise, there was a haphazard arrangement of low stones, large spined shrubs growing wildly between the cacti, and a distance he had yet to reach, a large pond. Still, he conceived to himself that the cacti were rather interesting. He had never wandered into the Thar desert and visited the reaches of the Deccan that rarely saw rain, so he had never seen that type of plant before. Perhaps Indra would have been more amazed at these wonders if not for the fact that he was nervous. And for what? A woman? But not quite a woman. It was a similar feeling to when he was younger and had to take his exams to be watching. He'd be judged for this performance, not by her, but by some part of himself. His life had been in constant motion until this journey, a respite marked by the terrible news of his friend Nathan back home. And I'll keep the reading short just in the interest of time and turn it over to Nina.
Thanks, Nishant. How are you guys doing? Good. All right. I wanted to get a little vibe check going on before I dive in. Like the end of my bio said, I have an improv background, under BB improv. As a meeting team. But I always think what I get from improv is you're always co-creating, not with just each other, but the audience. So I hope we do that today. I hope that we come to some truths and some questions together. So I was just thinking of what you said, Nishant, about the meeting before they knew they were important. And that idea is really important in my book. I always think about it's a love story between me and my husband. He's Black and I'm Indian. And through our love story, I stitched together also a history of Afro-Asian connections throughout time. I use us to kind of dive deep and think about a shared history. And why anti-Blackness has existed and continues to fester in our community. But I often think about interracial love as there's a story told to us about how race as a story should be told. It should be a story of pain. It should be a story of struggle. And it is, but I think often the way that it is sold to us is a story of pain and struggle that in the confines of what white people can conceive of what the white world can conceive of as painful and as a struggle. And we're more than that. Our pain is more than that. Our vulnerabilities are more than that. And so is our love. So is how we love each other. And so I think about encounters with race and racism that happen in unimportant times, in times that we don't necessarily consider monumental or make like the TV movie of the week, version of racism. I'm talking about like me and my husband trying to hail a taxi cab together on the way to the airport and not being able to do that, or just being in the grocery store
things like that. And ultimately, my book is a romance, and I love romantic comedies. I'm just gaga for stupid romantic comedy in particular. But they always annoy me too. I love watching them in a hate watch type of thing. And I often say a white romantic comedy, a white American romantic comedy is a space of erasure. And a BIPOC or an Afro-Asian romantic comedy can be a space of remembering, of acknowledging our history, of being seen. So that's where I write from. And this is a little bit from right in the middle of the book. This is an essay. Broadly, I'd just like to set it up a little bit. The ties between Trump and Hindu nationalism. And with that said, I wanted to also say free Palestine, free Sudan, free Israel. Shithole country clubs. Wedding planning is a constant weighing of choices. South Asian weddings in America are a constant wait for choice. To find out what choices, if any, we have. My wedding venue was one of my own choosing. Well, of my own choosing, and one that checked off all the boxes I learned to consider when venue hunting. Box 1. Will this place allow outside food, meaning non-white people food, Indian food, or as we Indian people call it, food? Box 2. What about fire codes? Can a oven be lit there? Do we need to get a fire marshal involved? Box 3. Can its grounds be accommodated? Can its grounds accommodate a broad horse? If a horse is too much, how about an elephant? Last box. And perhaps most important, how close is it to my hometown of Edison, New Jersey? This wasn't for any sentimental reasons, but rather in case, as my mother put it, we forgot a sorry. I chose a local hotel where the white lady who worked in events impressed me with her pronunciation of Indian wedding customs. She guided my mother and me through the hotel parking lot, our broad parade route, up into the lobby where we normally have our meal meetings, describing it all with neither a pretentious white woman at a yoga studio flourish, nor a callous I can't be bothered butchering. A few months later, in October 2011, our 2-day Afro-Indian wedding followed the path the white lady laid out. It was an action-packed event. There was a horse to mount, a fire to circle, a broom to jump over, and Quincy and I did it all. But even though the wedding album so clearly shows us broth parading all over the hotel courtyard, and the men of the bridal party and the groom's party exchanging garlands in the lobby, even though Quincy and I walked around a fire and a miracle-decked conference room, and later, during the reception, jumped the broom on the dance floor before commencing the traditional electric slide. Even though my mother still complains about how a suitcase filled with turbans could go missing in the hotel halls. Who would want so many turbans? Even so, despite all the in-person, photographic, and videographic proof otherwise, my father still says, "Remember your wedding at Trump?" I'll leave it there.
That's great. All right. Thank you, both of you, for reading such wonderful excerpts. And I'm sure that'll inspire all of you to go out and get the book right after this is done, if you haven't already. So I'm going to ask you, both of your books are obviously, have love in it, right? So I'm curious about this idea of love as cultural translation. You've both written these relationships where people are essentially learning about each other's worlds through intimacy, right? So what drew you to explore that? You through fiction, you through essays, right? How do these personal connections end up revealing so-called bigger truths about what it means to belong?
That's a great question. In my book, I actually purposefully did not focus too much on cultural conflict. And there was a historical reason for that. There were quite a few men at this point who married, Indian men who married these white women who then joined the Indian nationalist movement. There were about 5 different cases. And I thought, if that keeps happening with such regularity, at the historical moment, cultural difference wasn't a big enough wall for them to prevent love from happening. It wasn't, for at least the women who were attracted to these causes, they weren't being stopped by the specter of difference. And so what was more important to me was that these were just hyper-ambitious people whose own idea for themselves would actually bring them together and drive them apart. And so I think that sort of raw ambition for me was more important to explore, because there's a sort of Lacanian core to this book. And Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, said that at the center of desire is a feeling of lack. So what you desire is what you lack in yourself. And so at the beginning of this book, these characters feel this very intense sense of lack. They don't feel that they've achieved the success they want. They don't believe that they've become the person that they want to be, and so they're attracted to a version of what they see is them, or the potential for them. But as they become more successful, and as they fulfill that lack, they're sort of driven apart a little bit. And that's the tension, rather than the cultural tension, that is like the true tension at the center of this book.
I love that idea of kind of decentering that idea in order to get to a more, compelling place. I'm pretty, I think of myself as a plain Jane type of gal, everyday person, but during the course of my wedding, I very quickly became a bridezilla. It took me totally by surprise. At some point in New Jersey, we were at an Indian wedding warehouse, and I saw a litter carrier, and I was like, I want to be carried into my wedding. Yes, that makes total sense. And I just really went to some insane place. And in the middle of being very stressed out, I Googled Afro-Indian wedding stress, and nothing came up, not even a Reddit or anything. I just decided to write into that, what I was going through. And at first, I am someone who, leans on comedy, and at first I thought I was kind of writing some kind of comedic, almost like a parody how-to, a little bit like you see that in the checklist, right? But soon I realized I was writing personal essays, writing these memoirs that went to a more vulnerable place. And that started with the first essay I wrote was an essay about my husband cutting off his dreadlocks for the wedding. Dreadlocks that he had for 7 years. They're quite long, and my parents' pressure on him to cut these dreads, and his parents also were like, why don't you cut your hair? So they're kind of saying the same thing, but it's very different, even if they're saying the same thing. And I wanted to write into this really kind of difficult choice he was making, and also my connection to this choice. So I wrote this, that was the first essay I wrote, and it was the first time that I really felt like I was going to a deeper place than I thought I would. And it was a place of contradiction, because there's these really tough conversations about anti-Blackness in my family, conversations around hair and cutting of the dreads and what that means. But there'd also be moments where my mom would be just obsessed that he hadn't eaten enough. Did he eat? Or him running in the door and her making sure he has a tikka on. And I could not, my brain broke. My brain broke with these two things happening at the same time. And I wanted to tell that story about racism. I wanted to tell, and not to apologize or to make it Hallmarky. I wanted to make it hard. I wanted to make it difficult to sit with. in a way that felt like the most truthful version of what I wanted to. Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. No, thank you for sharing that. It's just so amazing that both of you are writing stories or digging up these stories, documenting things that most of us might not have encountered yet or heard of. I know, Nishant, that the Gadar movement was an inspiration in this, but more importantly, interracial love in a time when the Asian Exclusion Act and immigration laws looked at immigrants as enemies. And Nina, your work looking at these complex racial dynamics within our own communities in contemporary times, right? And did you both feel like you had to inhabit this role of being a culture bearer of sorts in which you are writing about your culture for other people to understand, or was this more a negotiation of what was going on in your mind and trying to put that on the page? And do you worry about readers getting the context, or are you okay with them doing the homework, trying to figure out some of the things where you don't spell it out? Yeah, I always say that I'm not an expert on any field in particular, but I am an expert in my story, and that's what this book is. And though it is a combination of memoir and research, that was really exciting to do. For example, in this essay about Quincy cutting his dreadlocks, I pull in a lot of hair history, especially history around enslavement and cutting of hair. And that's from this great scholar, Jasmine Cobb, who has a whole wonderful new book called New Growth on that. But what I found as I did this work is that the research was just the process of discovery for me. So I feel like I'm a lot like, I don't feel necessarily like a responsibility to educate, but I feel like one with the reader. I hope we're on, if they are discovering things as they read my book, I want them to know that I was discovering them too. I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna put this in my book. My mind is blown. And it was important for me to have that sort of electricness in the page, rather than I'm telling you, rather than I'm giving. Well, a lecture is an important genre of writing too, but rather than writing a lecture, I wanted to include the reader in this moment of discovery that I was going through myself. And I had something else to say about that, but this is what I want to say is that, I thought writing a collection of personal essays that really, the personal would come from me sharing my stories, all the details of my life. But really, once I added the research, the book felt most like me. That's when the character of Nina really popped, and that just really blew my mind, and will continue to be something I take as I work on further books. It's really incredible. And to me, it just reminds me that history is us. It's part of, always to affirm that those histories that we bring in are as integral, as intimate as any other intimate thing that we share. History is intimacy. Yeah.
I think rather than the characters bearing a cultural weight, a cultural expectation, each character in this book bears the weight of the nation. The Hungarian writer Lalita Krasznahorka, in his book Saving Finland, said that the world in the absence of God is a network of interdependency operating under enormous fluctuating pressures. And the characters in this book feel those fluctuating pressures brought to bear by the nation or the empire from which they hail. For example, at many points in this book, minor characters are remarking, we can't be deported because deportation means death. And at the time, if they were deported back to India, they would be executed. And now couldn't have predicted that at the moment of publication, people would be saying that refrain again, that they can't be deported to a super prison in Central America because they will die. But what the connection between now and then is that the weight and pressure of the nation is that it's a nation that every 20 to 30 years decides that it doesn't like immigrants. It happened with the Know Nothing Party in the 19th century, it happened with the Asian Exclusion Act in the early 20th century, it happened with Operation Wetback in the mid-20th century, and it's happening again. And so that's bearing the brunt of the nation upon your shoulders is a thing that these characters, and I think in both novels, the characters are constantly having to negotiate that in a small domestic space, in a marriage, in a family setting. And so the reader, I hope, reflects on the history of the United States or their own experience with empire, and rather than sort of explaining culture, I find myself as a bearer, almost a bearer of bad news about the country in which we live. This is the history of our country, this is the history of America. When I was publishing this book, in the sort of machinations of publishing, I was told that this is an Asian American book. And I said, no, this is a deeply American book. This is an American archive, this is an American story, and this can be told at various points with characters subbed in and out of American history. And so I think rather than trying to field the role of cultural translator, I feel a very traditional role of being a historian in the sense of bringing the fractures of the nation to bear on the page. And the difficult part of being a novelist is I can do that within a story that reads, which is entertaining, which makes you want to turn the page, which I hope happens in this book. But underneath the sort of plot and the movement of the narrative, there's this whole machinery, all these cogs moving of history that you spoke about, history and research, and trying to find truth and power to convey.
That's, both of you have said such profound things. And, a lot of people might look at your work and say, oh, this is, part of the diaspora experience. I mean, your characters do code switching, living between worlds, never quite fitting in, but what did it reveal to you in your process of writing for both of you? I mean, did you learn something new about yourself, even though there's all this historical research and, your story is, it's a historical novel and you did a lot of research in order to understand who you are. Like, is there something new you discovered about yourself through all of this?
Yeah, this is like it's like a therapy question. I'm trying to like wrap it around my head. So much. I feel like writing is as much of like an acquisition of knowledge. Sure, but it's also a divestment of what you think you know. You're just constantly getting out of your own way to get to something very truthful. Constantly negotiating your blind spot rather than necessarily what you see. So I, saw myself in new ways throughout the course of writing the book. I think it's true for this book, and I'm working on another book, so I realized like this is again another part of the therapy answer. Like you're constantly working out the same issues. They don't, you're going to encounter them even once you feel like you've mastered it and wrote a book. I think the biggest thing that I think about is like shame and stigma, the ways that I've inherited that, like generations of silence, and how that bears upon literally like my own hesitations when I write. That's like the big thing that I think about, and what it means to like dive into those histories. Why am I? A big part of this book, alongside the love story, is it's a mental health story. It's about my diagnosis of bipolar disorder. It appears in the book, and I pull that thread. It's one of the threads that I pull through, and it was very much harder for me to write than I realized. Anytime I tried to write it, it felt like I was, you know, like when you're like, realize you're like biting your lip and you're like, oh, why am I causing myself pain? I was doing that, like the writing version of that. I was doing something it was not writing, it was like some sort of self-inflicted shame that was going on the page. And so I knew I wanted to tell the story about my mental health, and in particular my mental health in a broader, you know, South Asian community that I grew up in, their connection, the way that they do and do not speak about mental health. And I needed to find a way to talk about that where divested of shame. So that was like a big part of my journey.
I think perhaps my answer will be a little less satisfying than that, which is very moving. In that I don't think I write for self-discovery, but just the act of discovery is the pleasure in itself. I remember when I was in graduate school for history, I was a little bit concerned because when you go to graduate school, you have to find focus, and that is your focus for the rest of your career. And I thought, I just want to be a dilettante. I want to change what I study, what I look at every 3 or 4 years. And so the pleasure of being a novelist is that that is exactly what I do, and I get to change my entire research focus every 4 years. But in this book in particular, the act of discovery that was the most pleasing was, you know, this book is still a romance at its core, and I've never written a romance, I don't read romances, and so I wanted to treat writing a love story as a project in itself. And so I started reading almost treatises on love, and it took me through this weird route through French literature. I read a lot of Annie Ernaux, I read a lot of Marguerite Duras, I read a lot of Lacan, I read Roland Barthes on love, and it was just this wonderful, very French exploration of what it means for two people to come together and two people to find love, and what does it mean when that love breaks, and what that means that love to sustain. And so I don't think I would have ever, if you had asked me when I started this book, are you going to spend 6 months reading 20 books from French authors about love? What has happened in the book and why has that happened? But that act of discovery, I think, is one of the most pleasurable things a writer can do, is because the book, it's funny, when you write the book, you don't get to talk about the book. You can talk about the book years after you write the book. But that moment of writing is one of solitude, but of such joyous solitude, because you are in so many different places all at once. No threads have come together. You're just there and you're experiencing it, and you get to do that every day. And it's such a true joy. I'm doing that with another book now, and because of the threads are together, I can't talk about it. But it's hard to explain for most writers because they're always speaking in the past tense when they talk about that joy and that pleasure of discovery. That was in this book too. That made up a good portion of this book.
I love
I think that word pleasure is so important. It's so part of the revolution in ways that we need to like continue to delve into and affirm. I remember when I was having a conversation when I first started to think about writing my mental health story, my bipolar disorder story. I talked to my mentor at graduate school, Margot Jefferson, who wrote this amazing books. One is called Negroland, and the other one's called Constructing a Nervous System. And I think I was like I never went to office hours ever. At this point, I was like in my 30s. I'd like never visited a professor's office, and I came in and I was like, didn't even make sense. I was like, bipolar mania, help. Like I just, and then I told her I wanted to write about my manic episode, my first manic episode, and she asked me if I remember during that time experiencing any pleasure. And that was the moment where the shame story changed to a different way of telling. All of a sudden, I remember putting on a fuchsia dress as I was getting in the car. In the middle of my manic episode, I was driving across the country. But rather than telling a story about like, oh, here's this crazy girl driving across the country, I started to just tell this story of this heroine that made this choice to put on a fuchsia dress. And that's actually the title story of the book. That's the first story I wrote in full. It became that. And so pleasure, I think, is really an important word choice.
Thank you. I mean, there must be, there is, right, so much vulnerability in sharing, your life in these essays, right? And, how is it to have these harder conversations that you're having and what you're having too? I mean, you don't pull any punches when you talk about racism and mental health in the South Asian community. And Nishant, you're actually showing like the violence and complexity of our history of that time, right? So how do you write critically about your communities? I mean, is it that you're going through some truth? And balancing that must be really tricky. And I'm also curious to know, have you received any sort of resistance? Have there been people who said, how can you write about this? Or, I mean, especially in the case when you're writing about your own life, but you too, I'm curious to know what the response to your works have been.
I think this question in particular takes a certain resonance in this book because at one point the characters move from the West Coast to New York City, where they find the reception in the Indian community somewhat lacking. Their interracial marriage is viewed as betraying the cause of India. There's a whole thread of eugenics that runs through this book. And eugenics in 1917 was a very popular idea. The first president at Stanford was a rampant eugenicist. He was also very passionate about anti-imperialism, that you did not act in tension because if you believed in the purity of the races, one race should not take over the country of another race. They should remain completely separate. And so this thread of eugenics sort of makes its way into the Indian nationalist movement, where how can you see yourself as a nationalist if you married a white woman? And so they really feel on the outs by Indians themselves rather than a sort of white American audience. And so there are these complexities that are brought to bear in the historical record that I think are uncomfortable to think about, but nevertheless, have to have a place because a book, for it to be enjoyable, has to be rendering the highest possible justice to this world. And to do that is to not ignore. It's be very easy for me to say as a father, eugenics bad. Don't do eugenics. But that's not what these characters were thinking. They were passionate eugenicists. They were passionate anti-imperialists. They were passionate supporters of their motherland. What happens to hold these thoughts in conversation in one's own mind will kind of fracture the person of that. And I think that's the complexity that might be a little uncomfortable, to think that, oh man, these people are kind of racist, so they're not very nice, and they're treating these people terribly. But I do think it has a place. And in a few interviews that I've done, I think folks of Indian descent sort of appreciated that, in New York, there are a lot of Bengalis and they hate the Punjabis. And it's sort of like, that kind of happens in Indian culture. We are very territorial and very close-minded at times. And that line in particular came from the elder statesman of the nationalist movement, Lalita du Perron. In one of his memoirs said that he hated interacting with the Bengali nationalists in New York City because they were so close-minded, because they could not see Punjabi as a fellow man. They could not see someone from Maharashtra as a fellow man. They only saw Bengali as a fellow man. And so it's sort of, not so nice part about being an Indian was present 100 years ago as it is today.
Absolutely, I was going to say that. We still see that. We still have that. People can be very liberal when it comes to the American government, and then for Hindutva and the Indian government, they can be extremely conservative. I mean, it's interesting to see how these patterns sort of repeat themselves also, right? But yeah, Nina, I wanted to hear about your experience, or regarding the question that I just asked, that how do you write critically about the communities you're part of and that you love, and how do you balance that, and what is the response to your work?
Yeah, I just want to create complicated human portraits. That's what I hope to do. It's terrifying to do that work because you are showing everybody warts and all, but I think if you do that with integrity, with love, if you're still unfiltered in how you show people, you create characters that people are rooting for no matter what. In the essay that I read, a little bit of my father's part of Trump National Golf Club. And it was the first time I'd ever written about my father, his relationship with Trump National Golf Club. I'm giving away a little bit of the essay, but he did have a wedding party for me there. I'm not going to give away more. There's something that happened. But that's my writerly way of saying it. There's something that happens. But it was a tough essay to write, but it felt important to me to tell the truth about him, about myself, about all of us, all together. And I considered it, a labor of love. I hope that the people who read it, I don't have control over what people think, do see it as a love letter, even if it's one that has a lot of tension in it. And so that's really important to me. I guess this is another way of thinking about it. There's two different ways of thinking about it. Is one, I'm going to put my comedy professor hat on, which is like, now I'm just going to kill all the jokes. That's what we call it in comedy. Once you start to explain how the joke is made, you just kill it. So sorry about that, but the thing that I really love to play with in my writing is comedic juxtapositions, and putting two unlike things together is what makes a joke. Not forcing something funny to happen, but just literally putting two unlike things together and exploring them. And that to me was really like the way that I wrote about our encounters of racism. They're always occurred at these juxtapositions. And that is kind of like, for example, what this essay about my Shikha Country Clubs is about, this sort of like, loving Trump, let's cut that, this Trump wedding party that my father made, and then the juxtaposition of the violence of all that at the same time. So, and I think that underpins the story of my family's immigration, them coming through the 1965 Immigration Act. Nishant and I have books that occur in different times, yet I feel like what we've talked about yearly echo each other, the way that history repeats. They came, you could not have come on that act without the gains of the civil rights movement. And so that should be enough to then ally with the people that helped you come here and experience equity to a certain extent in a way that you otherwise wouldn't have without something like the Equal Rights Amendment passing. But that's not what happened. That allyship is not what happened. The LA riots is what happened. The shooting of Latasha Harlins by Swin Jadu is what happened. Those families that wanted to overturn affirmative action at Harvard is what happened. Officer Tao in front of George Floyd's body is what happened. And I wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore why that is it's not a funny juxtaposition, but I wanted to explore why that was and what traumas underpin anti-Blackness. And that's, again, not to apologize, but really I just wanted to explore, to tell those stories. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know how we're doing on time, how much.
10 minutes. Give me 10 minutes. Give it a hot.
10 minutes and then Q&A?
No.
Oh, we just have 10 minutes left. Oh, wow. Okay, so I guess let's wrap up the conversation. There's this saying, I think, by Audre Lorde as well as Avery Rich. They both say that the act of writing is a radical act. And, I feel that your work, both of you, work is very political, obviously, right? And, but in such a personal way. You make the personal universal through your work. And I really, really love that. That's what I strive for in my work as well. And while I feel it is intentional, but is this something you've set out to do, or it's just that that's just the nature of what you're writing?
Keep it brief, speaking of the audience questions. But the cover is blood red, not for Stanford Cardinal, but because these are characters coming to the fact that they are communists, they are socialists, they are coming of age as much as lovers as political agents. So that is the goal from the get-go. There is a epigraph from Marx in this book. It is a very political book from the get-go, and that was very
yeah, I mean, what is not political? This table is political, so I again also feel the pressure of time. So I'm like thinking what I was going to say. But I think it was just important to tell this story about two people that encounter racism and a variety of intersecting oppressions in ways that are both straightforward, that we understand, and ways that we don't understand. That's the story I wanted to tell that go unnamed. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's just been a new one. I've learned so much. Let's see what questions the audience might have. And yeah, maybe someone can help.
Hi, thank you all so much. I am so eager to dive into both of these works. I write about growing up 17 miles from the Appalachian Trail, 30 miles from the Mason-Dixon line, and I'm 59, so my hill to die on, which I understand now is not a big hill, apparently is not italicizing any of these words, right? Like, apparently people have been doing that, I missed that. But it feels very brave to me. I was wondering, what were your hills or mountains that you were like, this has to get in the book, this has to happen, this is my thing.
Can I just repeat the question for everyone? I'm going to summarize it. She, as a writer, is saying that she has her own hills to die on, and the question I think to these authors is, what is your hill to die on? Did I summarize it? Okay? Wonderful.
From earlier in the writing, this was a hill I knew I needed to die on, I suppose. The book is very much in conversation with modernist literature around 1917, especially Bengali modernism. And Bengali modernism is effectively parlor drama. It's people in a room coming to terms with themselves and the nature of who they are and where they are. And that can be very boring for a modern reader. I mean, modern readers need action. They need 30 seconds of TikTok. But I knew, if this book was going to be true to my vision, it had to have that feeling of parlor drama, even though they were from California, New York, and on trains. But I knew there had to have that modernist sensibility, that modernist feel. And I do think that might alienate some readers today, because it's slower and more methodical than what one might be used to. But it's like, they say don't kill your darlings, but just, life is short. All your darlings should be alive. Nurture them, make sure they're in the book. So that was for me something that had to stay, something I had to fight for with editors and agencies and all that.
Oh my god, I deeply co-sign this. Like, keep your darlings. This is like our writing workshop. After all our discussions of joy, I just totally agree with that. I just randomly had a memory of, there's a scene in this book, an essay I read about Mississippi masala. And I started the essay with me and Quincy watching this terrible Gwyneth Paltrow movie called Country's Gone, where she pretends she's a country singer or whatever. And it's so bad. I guess it's another hate watching moment. I did talk about hate watching, and my editor wanted to cut it for pacing. And when I think about it now, it's important to show portraits of Black and brown life that are uncommon, and even though it's just kind of a dumb movie, it just reminded me of how important is it to insist, even if it's a slow pacing, even if it doesn't seem necessary to the story of Mississippi Masala, to insist on those moments that do feel necessary to you, that do feel like they don't necessarily measure up to the thesis question, but they do, even if they seem like a square peg in a round hole. So I think that's really important, and I think connected to that is, once you get down the road, is audience, and really claiming who you think of as your audience, really seizing on that. For me, thinking about a Black and brown readership unapologetically, and how important that was in terms of the information I brought in, be it what I wanted to share alongside the research. Both those things felt very important. Yeah.
In fact, I'd like to say I'm very impressed with the honesty. You're so honest with whatever you said. In fact, what companies like in the US have always been a bad word. Your honesty, yourself describing it. But my question is, and this is something I obviously am a powerful writer. I'm trying to write, but are you at moments want to write something in your books, but you have to stop yourself, especially right now when you're doing what is happening outside? Right? We talk about honesty, but is there a time when you're like, okay, I cannot write this, I have to write, believe in it, but I cannot? Self-censorship.
Walter Benjamin, who was a German Jewish writer who eventually died by suicide trying to escape the Nazis, in an essay called an essay on translation, said that art is not for the a poem is not for the audience. A poem is never for the listener. You write for art which speaks to mankind in the abstract, but you're never speaking directly to a person. And I think if you start imagining the person, that's when you start getting in the realm of self-censorship and thinking about book bans or anything, any number of things that are happening. So I think it's actually, sometimes people say, don't forget your audience, don't forget who you're writing to, but I think sometimes it's also productive to forget them entirely and just remember that there's a North Star to every book, and you have to remain on that true north because the audience began.
And that you're go ahead. Also that you're your first and last audience. That's just really the most important thing. We can't endure in our writing life if we're not that for ourselves. And when I'm thinking about this question, it makes me think about the writer Isabella Hamad, and I saw her talk recently, and she talked about kind of the problem about writing Palestine, and just it was such a beautiful answer about the just sort of overwhelm that sort of feels paralyzing, like it feels like a wave knocking you over, to contain all that information in one place. And she talked a lot about coming at it from an angle. Like that's her strategy for writing Palestine. Like what does it mean to find an angle and for that to be a way that she's like knocked over by the wave. And I just thought that was like really powerful to share, and I feel that's true in a way of like making sure that your writing is a space of pleasure and a space of play. You can think about those angles as playful spaces, as a way of getting to something that is like overwhelming, that is vulnerable, that is deeply, that contains so much truth that it can feel hard. I had an editor, actually my first editor for Shikha Country Clubs when it was just an essay on the Asian American Writers Workshop website, Jyoti Natharajan. I gave her like a first draft of Shikha Country Clubs, and it was about 10 million things, and she just politely said, "Nina, how much can this story hold?" And I'll just never forget that. I think that's something that you can come back to and know that those other parts will go somewhere, not if, will.
I know time flies when we're having fun, and we have a million more questions for our wonderful panelists and our moderator, but our time is out. Remember, there is book signing in the courtyard, so can we give a big round of applause for all of you? Thank you, everyone. Thank you.